My name is Aoife, and about 6 months into my PhD, as an insurance policy, I produced a video to dance my PhD, because if I dance my PhD, then I definitely have to complete it. And after doing that, I wrote a book chapter, and I was so enthusiastic about it at the time that I was like, I'm going to choreograph all of my papers. So what we're all going to do tonight, I think you've all been sitting down for a very long time, so I'm going to invite you all to get up, and what we're going to do, well, no, you can stay in your seats. I'll explain what we're going to do first. Okay, what we're going to do, we're going to do a conga line to represent my first published paper. So this won't take the entire interval act. It'll take about kind of maybe 3 minutes, and then you can all sit down again, and I'll just explain a little bit about how the scientific publishing system actually works. So what we're going to do is we're going to get Lisa to be a helper. So she's going to go about halfway down the aisle. And I'm going to ask anybody who's wearing dark clothes to line up behind her, and we'll all do a conga line to represent my first paper. So yeah, if you're wearing dark clothes, you're lining up behind Lisa. Okay. Right, I'm going to stop the numbers there just to manage the room. Okay, so anybody wearing dark clothes, you're going to line up behind Lisa. Next, on either side of the room, if you're wearing light clothes, stand up, but stay in the same place. Okay? So if you're wearing light clothing, stand up. And if you have a floral print, then stay seated, but you're taking part. Okay? Okay, so do we have everybody lining up behind Lisa? You're all wearing dark clothes, and what you're going to represent is you are all natural gas. You are fossil fuel, you've been taken from the ground, and you have fossil fuel associated emissions. So you remember Art Cheeseman's talk? He's in my research group. He explained renewable gas. So everybody on this side, you are grass biomethane, and we're going to use you as a transport fuel. Everybody on this side who's standing up, you are grass biomethane, but we're going to use you for heat. Okay, am I making sense so far? Thereabouts. Okay, so grass biomethane, you put it through an anaerobic digester, you get a gas containing methane and carbon dioxide. You use our Cheeseman's technology to remove the CO2, and we're left with methane, and it can join the natural gas grid. So when the music starts, everybody who is transport will join the conga line, and heat, you all stay put. Okay? So let's play the music. Okay, go. Okay, and transport, you can all join in. Transport are allowed. Okay, and stop. Stop. Stop the music. Okay, so the reason transport is allowed to join the grid and heat isn't is because the EU rules, the European Union wants us to use renewable gas as a transport fuel. So as the gas is being created, it's a low carbon fuel, but it's not a zero carbon fuel. So there will be emissions along the way. And there's essentially creative emissions accounting. That means heat emissions are much higher than transport. So that means if we're using grass for a transport fuel, it can join the grid and it can be used. Whereas the heat emissions or the heat fuel, it's not allowed at the moment. So if we co-digest with slurry, then you'd reduce the emissions and it can join the grid. So I think Lisa's at the very end. So I'm actually going to stop you all there because otherwise there'll be too many people joining in. But give yourself a big round of applause and thank you very much for getting involved. Okay, so I'm going to let you all get seated. So choreographing your papers is actually a very fun thing to do if you want to move on from Famelab. And it's also, so you just got involved in dancing my paper, but you can also go on Science Direct, and for €30 you can download it as well if you want. And that's why I wanted to talk about the scientific publishing system in my talk, because I suppose sometimes when we're doing science communication, one of the ways of picking our topics is what don't I understand and what do I want to figure out? And I was like, I don't fully understand how the scientific publishing system works. So, I'm going to put some effort into it and try and figure it out. So here's my understanding so far. There's still some things that I find confusing. But in general, if this room was science, every single thing in it would have its own journal. So there'd be a journal of the Famelab backdrop, there'd be a journal of this microphone, there'd be a journal of me, there'd be a journal of you, there'd be a journal of you. Every single person in the audience would have their own journal. And then you'd have kind of umbrella journals that kind of go up the chain and give less detail, but they might be broader. So say, for example, you'd have the journal of everything on the stage, and then you might have the journal of the audience and everybody in it, and you'd have the journal of the ceiling. And then that would go up the chain until you have the big journals that you might have heard of, like Science and Nature and The Lancet. That'd be the journal of the Triskel Arts Centre. So when we do research, the ultimate aim is that something would be published. In academia, you don't exist unless you've published papers. So how does our research go from the lab, or from our computer, which is where I do my research, to get into a journal? First, we have to write everything up, and we don't just publish it immediately. It needs to be checked, and this is what we call peer review. So say, for example, this dress I'm wearing. I could tell you all that this is an Aoife. Aoife is like a totally important designer. And I'm quoting from Clueless there, we have to acknowledge our sources as scientists. So unless you've seen Clueless or you know fashion, you wouldn't necessarily know or recognize an Aoife dress. But some people might. So for example, most of the audience wouldn't, but one or two people might. And it's those one or two people that know and that recognize what you're studying, they are the people to review your work, because it's new to them too. You're adding new knowledge. So they review the work, they know it's an Aoife, they recognize it, it's not an Aoife, and then it gets published. So when everything gets published, as I said, you pay 30 quid and you can read the paper. So in the academic publishing system, researchers don't get paid and reviewers don't get paid, but universities who do the research pay to access everybody else's work. And that's also government funded who funded research. So it's almost like governments are paying twice for this. And this is seen as a big problem in research in terms of trying to understand, I don't know, what exactly are academic publishers doing? So it reminds me very much of the role of Frank in the Irish version of Say Yes to the Dress. Do you know that TV show where somebody's getting married and she tries on a load of dresses and the store assistants help her and they do all the legwork, and then it's a big moment where, you know, someone's saying, so are you saying yes to the dress? Well, in the Irish version, Frank does very little of value and then turns up at the end to ask that question. So that's my understanding so far of what publishers do. And people do see this as a problem because a lot of money is being spent and the public still don't have access to the research that's happening, which is important. So one way around this is open source publishing. And this is where you publish in an open source journal and the public can access it for free. But there's another problem. Open source publishing is still relatively new. So if I publish in an open source journal, it's like a retweet from Rob Kardashian. If I publish in one of the really big papers, it's like a retweet from Kim Kardashian. A lot more people are going to see it. So we go where the prestige is. And I suppose, where do I fit in this? I'm kind of criticizing the system. Am I complicit? And the answer is yes. So the book chapter I told you about earlier, that's for sale in a book that costs $136. Harry Potter costs about a tenner. Sorry. So I also didn't make my paper open source. I wasn't willing to spend the money on it. So the next step in terms of publishers responding to this problem of people not being able to access the research is that you can now subscribe to Science Direct to access 2 published papers a month. That's 24 in a year. So everybody who's not in research gets to read 24 papers a year. But then you have to read papers. So that's not necessarily going to be too much fun either. And this is where science communication comes in. So if we come back to this dress that I'm wearing, we're not necessarily dumbing anything down when we're doing science communication. We're just using different words and using a different language to talk about it. So for example, in a very small niche circumstances, say for example, if I was on the red carpet, then it matters if it's an Alaya. To everybody else, it's just a dress, and that's as much information as you need. So both things are actually correct. So having events like this and having the Bright Clubs and the Pint of Science and everything else that happens, those are all really important, one for training and for being the audience so we can all learn our skills, but also to get the information out there so that people who are paying for it can understand it enough to ask questions and inform policy. And finally, we get to actually enjoy our research an awful lot more when we use regular language. When I did my first paper, my genuine question was, does the end use of renewable gas matter? I was looking at certification. Does it matter if we use it for electricity, heat, or transport? And according to the rules, it does. We're allowed to use it for transport, but not for heat. So then my next question was, and this is possibly because I'm a middle child that I went for the underdog, but I was like, but what about heat? So in reality, if I was publishing my second paper, I'd be calling it, but what about heat? But what I'm really calling it is a case study of willow biomethane. It's a really dry and boring title. So I think science communication allows us to use the words that we would actually use in our heads when we're talking about our research. And the final enthusiasm, I suppose if you went to the beach and say if you saw a shark at the beach, you'd go back to your friends and you'd be like, hey, guess what? I saw a shark and it was like this and everybody was panicking and it was crazy and loads happened. Whereas if you're in science and you're writing that in a paper, you'd just say, a shark was observed at the beach. Anyway, thank you very much. It's been really a pleasure to talk to you.